What happens after a wildfire or some disaster? How is it that an ecosystem can be reestablished in an area? Well, there's two different patterns for establishing an ecosystem. One is primary succession. This is the first time there's life showing up in an area. After primary succession, anything that happens after primary succession is going to be called secondary succession. And the main difference has to do with the existence of life in that area. So in primary succession, we start with a pioneer species. There's no life, there's just rock or it's bare, there's nothing living there. But that pioneer species begins to be established in that new habitat. As that species dies and decomposes, it starts to form soil. That soil allows for other living things to take root in that barren area. As that soil layer deepens, larger and larger things can take root. So that becomes an intermediate community. Mostly you'll notice like it'll be brush and pine trees, softwood things. That's a characteristic of an intermediate community. The climax community then is the end of the succession. Normally in our area, that's going to be hardwood trees, oak trees, maple, and it'll be a mature forest. There'll be large trees, not a whole lot of underbrush, and that will be the climax community. So we can identify the climax community. We might call these biomes, where we might say that this is a deciduous forest biomes because the trees lose their leaves. Or we might say it's a desert biome, or we might say that it's a prairie, grassland. Well, those are characteristics of a climax community. What happens then to a climax community if there's a disaster? Let's say a wildfire uh, wipes the community out. You'll notice that there's still a large soil layer, a deep soil layer. That's characteristic of secondary succession. In primary succession, that soil had to be created. Here, that soil already exists. The wildfire or the disaster wiped out most of the living things, but they will soon be replaced. The seeds will start to grow from that fire. Those pioneer species will start to develop, soon become more brushy and shrubs. Then we'll have these things like pine trees, and eventually the climax community will be replaced. Typically, after an event like this, you get a lot of species diversity. There's a lot of new undergrowth before you get to that climax community. Other things might disturb an ecosystem, like, for example, flooding, or like, for example, paving might disturb an ecosystem. And you may have noticed that in abandoned parking lots, after a while, you'll see some grass growing in there or weeds poking up. Those are pioneer species. And given enough time, they might create a soil layer deep enough for other things to move back into that area. So sometimes those disturbances, like wildfires, can be caused by lightning strike, or sometimes that disturbance, like clearing land for farmland, let's say, is more human initiated. So a farmer is trying to increase the amount of produce they can make. They might clear some land, but if they were to stop maintaining it, it would eventually move into that secondary succession and eventually a climax community. Now, this might take 100 years or 200 years. You got to think of a big oak tree. It takes a long time to grow, but that's the idea of succession, that you have these pioneer species, then these intermediate shrubs, and this intermediate community, and then eventually the climax community is the end of the succession until there's some other disaster.